In this lecture, we are going to create our very own custom directive. By the end of this lecture, you are going to know how to create a basic directive using the directive decorator. You're going to know how to use selectors to associate an element with a directive based on an attribute. And you are going to know how to interact with the raw DOM element of the associated element from the directive. So we're going to create a directive to run as part of a very, very simplified version of our joke application. It just renders 3 jokes on the screen. We're going to create a directive which, if we add to an element, will set the background color of that element to gray. It's not a very exciting directive, but it's going to start us on the journey of being able to understand how to write our own custom directives. And we're going to call our directive CC_card_hover. And I want to attach it to the card block of each joke like so. Now the Angular team recommends using directives as attributes and prefixed with a namespace. So we've prefixed our directive with a namespace CC. Now we're going to create our CC_card_hover directive by annotating a class with the directive decorator. A few things first, we need to include the directive in our imports. And directive comes from Angular core. And we also need to declare our directives on the ng module. Back to here, let me stop it from running. So this code that we've written so far is very similar to what we would have written if this was a component. I mean, the first difference is that the decorator is directive and not component. But the second striking difference is that the selector is wrapped in square brackets, like so. To understand why we do this, we first need to understand that the selector attribute uses CSS matching rules to match a component or directive to an HTML element. And in CSS, to match a specific element, we will just type in the name of the element. So if this was CSS, and we wanted to match a rule to the input tag, we would type input, and then whatever properties we wanted to set, we would put inside here. And the same if it was a p tag. We would just type the name p. This is a CSS selector. And this is why previously, when we defined the selector in the component directive, we just wrote the name of the element. And in the CSS matching rules, that just matches onto an element of the same name. Now, if we wrote our selector as dot CC_card_hover, when you prepend something with dot and you apply some CSS matching rules, it matches based on a class name. So if we had a selector of dot CC_card_hover, to match onto our joke element, it would need to be a class like so. So now I've added the CC_card_hover as one of the classes for our joke. But we want to associate the directive to an element which has a certain attribute. So I want to associate it. I want to add our directive onto elements as attributes, just like this. And to do that in CSS, we wrap the name of the attribute with square brackets. So this is why in our directive selector, we've wrapped CC_card_hover in square brackets. The next thing we do is add a constructor to our directive. And I want to pass an argument to the constructor. I want to pass an instance of an element ref. Now, to use element ref, we have to import it. So let's do that. It's from Angular core again. So now let's scroll back down. Now, when the directive gets created, Angular can inject an instance of something called element ref into its constructor. Now, how this works is called dependency injection. It's a really, really important aspect of Angular, and we discuss this in detail in a later section. Now this element ref gives the directive direct access to the DOM element upon which it's attached. Now let's use this element ref to change the background color of our card to grey. Now the element ref itself is a wrapper for the actual DOM element, which we can get access to via the property native element. So I call L.native element, then I set the style, the background color style to grey. It should be background color, there we go. And now if I run this, we can see the background color of each element is now grey. But this, however, assumes that our application will always be running in the environment of a browser and will always be running with something called a DOM. But Angular has been built from the ground up to work in a number of different environments, including server-side via Node and on a native mobile device. So the Angular team has provided a platform-independent way of setting properties on our elements via something called a renderer. Now to use the renderer, we need to add it as an argument to our constructor. We also need to import it. And again, Angular uses dependency injection to actually inject into our constructor an instance of this renderer. And then instead of calling style.backgroundColor on our native element, we then use the renderer instead. We then go through the renderer instead. So we type we then call renderer.setElementStyle. We provide the native element as the first parameter, and then we just give hints as style we want to set on this element. So we've set background color to grey. And the important difference here is that if in the future we wanted to render our application on a platform other than a web browser, then the renderer calls the appropriate functions to change the background color on that platform. We're not limited to only being run in a web browser with a DOM. And I also forgot just to add a special comma here. And now if we run the application, we can see it's still setting the background color to grey. So in summary, we create a directive by decorating a class with the @directive decorator. The convention is to associate a directive to an element via an attribute selector. And by that I mean the name of the attribute is wrapped in square brackets. We can inject a reference to the element the directive is associated with to the constructor of the directive. And then via a renderer, we can interact with and change certain properties of that element. And what I've shown you so far is a very basic example of a custom directive. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you how you can detect when the user hovers over the card and a better way of interacting with the host element the directive is attached to.